everyone! Today I'm gonna paint a few portraits with acrylic, which I haven't done in a few years. I've never really been a big fan of acrylic since it dries so fast and it's hard to blend, but I realized I've never really given it much of a chance. These are the colors I think I'll be using for this painting. They might change a little along the way, but we'll see. Arteza has actually sent me a box of 24 acrylic paints to try out, which is super exciting. The box and the tubes themselves have labels with the lightfastness, transparency, and pigment number, which was nice to refer back to. For the most part, they seemed pretty vivid and the transparency reflected what was on the box, although the yellow ochre was a little more transparent than I'd like. I use that color a lot in oil paintings and it's one of the paints I can count on to be opaque, but I also don't know if that's something all acrylic yellow ochre paints have in common. I really liked the variety of colors in this box though. I definitely wasn't lacking in that department. Sorry for the mistakes on the labeling there. I am not organized and it shows. So I'm not only going to just try and paint with acrylic, I'm also going to try and make the acrylic behave as much like oil as possible by using different slow drying mediums, because I don't want to change. I just want to make the paint bend to my will, I guess. But really, my hope is that maybe this will help those of you who want to try oil painting for the slow drying qualities and vivid colors, but also feel overwhelmed by the thought of working with chemicals or don't want to spend a ton on new materials. I'm going to do 3 paintings to test out the different techniques. The first one I'm just painting with acrylic the way I learned to growing up, which is just to use water as a paint thinner. And the second and third paintings I'll be using the slow drying mediums. I don't work with acrylic a lot, and a lot of the reason is because I've found it hard to blend and move around on whatever surface I'm working on because it dries so fast. And to be honest, I've probably learned how to use it incorrectly and that's why I haven't liked it. But I think the last time I painted a portrait with acrylic was, I think, about 5 years ago. But that one I did in maybe a 1 or 2 hour sitting, and I've actually never put a lot of effort into painting a portrait with acrylic. But I've been working with oil for a few years now, and I feel like I've gotten a better handle on painting and just being patient altogether, so I wanted to see if I've improved with acrylic at all before I go in with the slow drying medium, just to see what I can do and how well the paints themselves do. I started out this first painting with a wash of acrylic and water to mimic how I usually start out with a wash of mineral spirits and oil paint, and I'm painting on a gesso primed hardboard just like my usual oil painting studies. First thoughts, I immediately realized that I was using way too little paint, both on my palette and the painting, because the paint began to dry after just a few minutes. I'd go back to the palette to grab a little bit of color just to find it had completely dried, and I would have to mix the color again. If you look at the amount of paint I put down on the palette, that's the amount that I usually need for an oil painting this size, and I don't even usually use all of it in one sitting. But with acrylic it felt like I just kept wasting the paint because I kept accidentally letting it dry. I was really only able to blend in the first few seconds of putting paint down, and then it started drying while I was painting, and I ended up dry brushing instead for some of the strokes, which gave a more rough texture and made the paint sit more irregularly. I just didn't like it. Doing the background, I was trying to work somewhat fast and use more paint so that the strokes would be smooth and blend into one another, but I still ran into the same problems a bit, so I added some water to certain parts to add a bit of different textures that matched the first wash and helped to blend things together as well. I realized around this point that I should have been using more water to keep the paint wet longer, so I started using more for the hair, and later I did some glazing with very thin layers of paint with the water, so I was able to get more smooth color transitions in the skin and get more smooth just lines in general. One thing I learned in this first painting was how much I'm used to blending colors on the painting itself. So I'd find myself going in with darker or lighter colors than I'd actually want and expect it to be able to blend into the mid-tone color that I had laid down first. But then they'd just lay on top of the color instead, so it looked less smooth and more splotchy. The thin layer of water and paint helped a little, but it just still wasn't my cup of tea. If I were to do this again, I probably would have just used thicker layers of paint to make it easier to blend in the beginning, and I've also heard that spraying your paint with water helps to keep the paint wet and workable for longer, so that's also something I wish I would have tried out. I think we're gonna call this one done though, because I don't want to get too hung up on it, so let's move on. For this one, we're gonna try out a gloss glazing liquid. This stuff claims to improve brushability and says that it's useful for wet and wet blending, which is one of the things that I love about oil painting. It also says that it's great for glazing, which makes sense given the title. Now, I don't know if I was supposed to do this, but I mixed the glazing liquid with the water for the wash, and then I realized I didn't know how water would react. So I think we're okay. I don't know if something terrible is gonna happen later, but let's hope we're okay. I started mixing the rest of my colors with the glazing liquid, then started laying in my first layer, and it was immediately better. The paint glided on smoothly, even though it stayed only workable for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes than it did in the last painting, but just those extra minutes were a game changer. The glazing liquid lowered the opacity of the paint a little, but I definitely didn't mind. It still didn't stay wet for nearly as long as oil, which with the same amount of paint usually stays wet for several hours, if not days, depending on the color, but I was still able to blend on it after about 10 minutes. The texture almost reminded me of using oil with gel medium, which is one of my favorites to paint with. I also liked the fact that this glazing liquid didn't have a cap on how much you could use. I ended up putting a small amount onto my palette to dab my brush into and wake up some of the almost dry colors, and also create more transparent colors that I could use for glazing. If you don't know what glazing is, it's the technique of using a very thin, transparent layer of paint which changes the appearance of the paint underneath rather than concealing it. So after this painting, I actually looked up what water does to the paint, and I probably should have done this before I started painting either of these, but it turns out that adding more than 50% of water to acrylic paint actually can cause the polymer in the paint to break down and make it less adhesive. which can result in peeling or flaking at some stage, or lifting of the paint when you paint layers over it. I also learned that apparently when you paint on an absorbent surface like an unprimed canvas or paper or wood, you can use any amount of water because the fibers will hold the pigment and will absorb the excess water. But if you're using a non-absorbent surface like a primed canvas or what I've been painting on, most manufacturers recommend using no more than 30% to thin your acrylics to keep it on the safe side. High quality paints actually can handle more water than low quality paints, so some artists will still water their paints down using as much as 80% water, but use very high quality paints to do so. So far, I haven't experienced any peeling or flaking on either of these paintings, so I'm taking that as a sign that I haven't messed up completely. So if you're doing acrylic painting with a wash like that, just be careful of using a lot of water. With mediums like the one I've just used, you can use as much as you want with the paint because acrylic mediums have the same resin in them that makes the paint stick. Some mediums though, like flow improver and retarding mediums, which is what I'll be using next, are actually additives. So they don't have the same acrylic binders that paints do, so you have to be sure to follow the instructions and put as much in as the manufacturers say to. Now as I go through these 3 paintings, my guess is that I'm gonna slowly improve just because I'm painting the same thing 3 times, and we'll get a better idea on what colors to use and how the proportions work. At least I hope that's the case. But hopefully you'll also be able to see the differences in the texture and process from the different mediums used as well. Now as I was painting this one, I realized just how badly messed up the proportions were on the first painting, but as I finished this, it became clear that this one had some problems too. But I'm deciding to give myself a break because I'm spending much less time on these than I normally would since I'm just getting the hang of acrylic and I just want to see how the paint works. I'll have another chance to get things right in the next painting anyway. A little tip for cleaning off dried paint is to use acetone. It makes it much easier to clean off a palette, but I also noticed it makes the acrylic paint kind of gluey, so be sure to have a paper towel on hand. Now for this last painting, I went into it thinking I was only going to use this Slow-dri fluid additive. But then I realized that my main goal was to make it act as much like oil as possible, so I decided I was going to use every single technique I had available That meant adding the additive to the paint beforehand to reduce the drying time, then leaving some glazing liquid on the palette to be able to reactivate the paint and blend better on the surface, and lastly, use water to increase the viscosity for painting things like the hair. The additive claims to extend the time of your color or medium by 40%, so it's blendable and workable for longer, and it also lowers viscosity. But to be honest, I couldn't tell if it was working or not. I just started reaching for the glazing gloss over and over again because I liked the smoothness and its ability to reactivate some of the paint that had already dried. I think you can already tell the blending in this one is already a lot smoother and cleaner. As far as these paints go, they were really fun to use. I loved the colors and they were smoother than other acrylics that I've used in the past. It was kind of a bummer though when I looked into the lightfastness ratings of these paints. A level 1 lightfastness is best, meaning that the colors will last as long as 100 years, while level 3 means it will last 15 to 50 years. And most of these paints had a lightfastness rating of 3. So if you're a professional, you might want to skip out on these paints, but I'd say these are more for people who are just getting started and don't want to worry about spending a lot on art supplies. Overall, I still have to work very fast compared to oils, even with these slow-drying mediums. But for those of you transitioning into oils from acrylic or painting with acrylic but want your paint to last longer, I definitely recommend trying them out. Using acrylics with slow-dry mediums may help your paint last longer and help you not use as much paint altogether, which will let you spend less on art supplies. So I think it's a win-win situation. This was a really fun process, and looking back at all the paintings, it's interesting to see the very visible changes in techniques, proportions, not to mention the lighting and the colors. To me, it's just a very visual representation of how you can improve with practice.